The salt-laced air of Myrtle Beach in April is a unique perfume, a potent cocktail of sunscreen, fried dough, and the boundless optimism of youth. It's a scent that promises freedom, a temporary reprieve from the structured world of high school hallways and parental rules. For 17-year-old Brittanee Drexel, that scent was an irresistible siren call. In the spring of 2009, she was a young woman standing on the very edge of her life, a vibrant, headstrong teenager from Rochester, New York, with a future as wide and open as the Atlantic horizon she longed to see. Brittanee was known for her bright, infectious smile and a fierce loyalty to her friends. She was a talented soccer player, quick on her feet, a trait that mirrored her sharp wit and bubbly personality. But beneath the surface of this typical American teenager, there was a quiet struggle, born with a condition that left her blind in one eye. Brittanee had endured countless surgeries and the casual cruelty of childhood taunts. These experiences hadn't broken her. They had forged a resilience, a determination to live without limits, to prove she was more than her disability. This inner fire, however, also fueled a rebellious streak. She yearned for the rites of passage she saw in movies and heard about in whispers between classes. And in 2009, the ultimate rite of passage for a high school junior was spring break in Myrtle Beach. The very idea was a fantasy, a week of sun, sand, and independence. But when Brittanee presented the plan to her mother, Dawn, the dream met a firm reality. Dawn felt a deep, unsettling premonition, the kind of parental intuition that defies logic but chills the soul. She didn't know the friends Brittanee planned to travel with, and the thought of her daughter, hundreds of miles from home, with no adult supervision, was a scenario fraught with peril. The answer was a definitive no. The arguments that followed were heavy with the weight of a teenager's desperate desire for freedom and a mother's instinct to protect. The tension in their home grew thick, a palpable wall between a mother and daughter who, at their core, adored each other. Finally, seeking a truce, Brittanee offered a compromise, a few days at a friend's house nearby to cool off. Dawn, hoping to mend the rift, agreed. She had no way of knowing that the bag Brittanee packed wasn't for a sleepover down the street, but for a clandestine journey south, a secret trip that would become the first step into a 13-year nightmare. The lie was a small tear in the fabric of their trust, a tear that would soon rip wide open, exposing a chasm of fear and uncertainty. The drive down to Myrtle Beach was likely a blur of highway hypnosis and escalating excitement. For Brittanee and her friends, every mile marker was a step further away from the familiar and closer to the promise of adventure. They arrived at the Bar Harbor Hotel, a typical beachfront property buzzing with the electric energy of spring break. The air was warm, the music was loud, and the sense of liberation was absolute. Brittanee, wanting to maintain a sliver of normalcy with her family, called her mother, telling her she was at the beach. It wasn't a complete lie, but it was a world away from the truth. Dawn, picturing a local beach on the shores of Lake Ontario, felt a wave of relief. The deception, for a moment, seemed harmless. For a few days, Brittanee lived the fantasy she had chased. The sun warmed her skin, the ocean waves provided a constant, rhythmic soundtrack, and the nights were a dizzying kaleidoscope of lights, music, and new faces. It was everything she had wanted, but the carefree illusion was fragile, destined to shatter in the most brutal way imaginable. On the night of April 25th, the fantasy began to unravel. The day had been spent in a sun-drenched haze, but as dusk settled over the Grand Strand, a different kind of energy took hold. Brittanee decided to leave her friends at the Bar Harbor Hotel and walk a mile and a half down the iconic strip, South Ocean Boulevard, to visit another friend staying at the Blue Water Resort. The walk was a sensory overload, the neon glow of hotel signs painting the pavement in lurid colors, the rumble of cars cruising the strip, the overlapping bass beats spilling out from bars and clubs, and the roar of the unseen ocean just beyond the dunes. It was a walk she had likely seen countless others make, a seemingly safe path through the heart of the bustling resort town. Security cameras at the Blue Water Resort captured her arrival, a grainy image of a girl in a black and white tank top, shorts, and flip-flops, carrying a beige purse. She met her friend, spent some time there, and then, at approximately 8:45 p.m., the cameras recorded her leaving, a solitary figure stepping back out into the electric night. She sent a text message to her boyfriend back in New York, a simple, mundane message saying she was heading back to her hotel. It was the last message she would ever send, the last time anyone, save for her killer, would ever see her alive. As the minutes stretched into an hour, then two, a seed of unease was planted among her friends. In the chaotic, fluid environment of spring break, it was easy to lose track of people. But as the night deepened and her bed at the Bar Harbor Hotel remained empty, that unease began to blossom into genuine worry. The following morning, the worry turned to panic. Brittanee was gone. Her clothes, her belongings, everything she had packed for the trip were still in her hotel room. Everything except for the beige purse she carried and the cell phone that was now her only lifeline. The friends, young and suddenly overwhelmed, made the call they had to make, the one that would officially burst the bubble of their vacation and alert the world that something was terribly wrong. Back in Rochester, Dawn Drexel's phone rang, and with that ring, the disquieting premonition she'd had days earlier returned with the force of a physical blow. Her daughter was missing. The words didn't compute, a surreal and terrifying puzzle. She had thought Brittanee was just a few miles away. The revelation of the secret trip to Myrtle Beach was a secondary shock, eclipsed by the primal fear that now gripped her. The drive to South Carolina was an agonizing journey into the unknown, every mile a torment of unanswered questions and terrifying possibilities. When Dawn arrived in Myrtle Beach, she stepped into a world that had transformed from a vacationer's paradise into the epicenter of her worst fears. The sun, the sand, the cheerful facades of the hotels, it all seemed like a cruel mockery. The Myrtle Beach Police Department was already at work, piecing together the last known hours of Brittanee's life. They secured the surveillance footage from the Blue Water Resort, the ghostly, silent images of Brittanee arriving and leaving, providing the first concrete pieces of the timeline. Investigators spoke to her friends, to the people she had visited, trying to draw a map of her interactions. A name surfaced: Peter Brazowitz, a club promoter from her hometown area, who was the last person known to have seen her. But interviews with him and his friends yielded nothing. They were just one of many threads in a rapidly tangling web. The most critical clue, however, was silent and invisible. It was the signal from Brittanee's cell phone. In the hours after she vanished, her phone didn't go silent. It began to move. Technicians from her service provider began tracking the phone's pings, the digital breadcrumbs it left as it connected with cell towers. The signal wasn't in Myrtle Beach. It was moving south, steadily, purposefully, down US Route 17. The pings painted a chilling picture of a journey away from the crowded, brightly lit tourist strip and into the darker, more isolated rural landscapes of South Carolina. The signal traveled for nearly 60 miles into the marshy, alligator-haunted low country of Georgetown County. And then, in the early hours of April 26th, it stopped. The digital ghost vanished. The silence was abrupt, final, and deeply ominous. This remote, swampy area, a world away from the neon lights of Ocean Boulevard, now became the focal point of a desperate search. For 11 days, law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and volunteers scoured the dense woodlands and murky waterways. They waded through swamps, their eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance, any piece of discarded clothing, anything that could tell them what happened after the pings went dead. The search was grueling, physically and emotionally. The humid, oppressive heat of the South Carolina low country seemed to swallow sound, hope, and energy. Every day ended in the same heartbreaking way, with nothing. The woods kept their secrets, and Brittanee Drexel had vanished as if consumed by the very land itself. Years began to pass, each one a monument to a family's unending grief and a community's frustration. For Dawn Drexel, the search never ended. She relocated to Myrtle Beach, a gut-wrenching decision to remain in the last place her daughter was seen alive, to be a constant, visible reminder to law enforcement and the public that Brittanee was not forgotten. She became a fierce advocate, a detective in her own right, chasing down leads, giving interviews, and keeping her daughter's face in the news. The case became a fixture in the true crime world, a cautionary tale of spring break dangers. But leads grew cold, and the promising technological clue of the cell phone pings had led only to a dead end. The investigation, for all its effort, had stalled. The family was trapped in a tortuous limbo, unable to mourn, unable to move on, haunted by the specter of the unknown. They were adrift in a sea of what-ifs, each theory more painful than the last. Was she taken by a stranger? Was it someone she knew? Was she alive somewhere, held against her will? Or had she met a violent end in the dark swamps of Georgetown County? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, for 7 long, agonizing years. Then, in 2016, a bombshell. The FBI, which had joined the investigation, held a press conference that sent shockwaves through the community and reignited national interest in the case. They announced a chilling development. They no longer considered this a missing person case. They were officially investigating Brittanee's disappearance as a homicide. The source of this reclassification was a jailhouse informant, a man named Taquin Brown, who was serving time for an unrelated crime. Brown came forward with a story so horrific, so detailed, that it seemed to finally unlock the secrets of what had happened to Brittanee. He claimed that in the days after her disappearance, he had visited a stash house in McClellanville, a small town within the search area of Georgetown County. There, he alleged, he witnessed a group of men, including a local man named Timothy Sean Taylor, sexually assaulting Brittanee. Brown's narrative was the stuff of nightmares. He described seeing Brittanee, alive but terrified, trying to escape. He claimed to have heard gunshots and then witnessed a body, wrapped and concealed, being removed from the house to be disposed of in one of the many alligator-infested swamps that dotted the landscape. The informant's story was a game changer. It provided names, a location, and a gruesome sequence of events. The full weight of the FBI's resources now descended upon Timothy Taylor and his associates. Taylor, who was only a teenager himself at the time of Brittanee's disappearance, vehemently denied any involvement. He insisted he had no idea who Brittanee was and had never seen her. But the informant's tale was compelling, and the FBI put immense pressure on Taylor, hoping to force a confession or a break in the case. They charged him with an unrelated federal crime, a move his lawyers claimed was a tactic to leverage him into cooperating with the Drexel investigation. For years, the narrative held, Brittanee Drexel had been the victim of a gang-related abduction and murder. Her body fed to alligators. The media ran with the lurid details, and for a public desperate for answers, it seemed like the case was on the brink of being solved. Extensive searches were conducted in and around McClellanville, focusing on alligator ponds. But once again, the searches yielded nothing. No physical evidence, no remains, no DNA, nothing to corroborate the informant's story. Timothy Taylor, despite the immense public suspicion and legal pressure, was never charged in connection with Brittanee's disappearance. The promising lead that had ripped the case wide open had devolved into another frustrating dead end, leaving the family and investigators back where they started, with no body, no concrete evidence, and no justice. The collapse of the Timothy Taylor theory was a devastating blow. It felt like the case had not just stalled, but moved backward, lost in a wilderness of misinformation. But behind the scenes, a quiet, methodical re-examination of the evidence was beginning. Investigators, freed from the tunnel vision of the stash house narrative, decided to go back to the very beginning, to the most solid piece of evidence they had ever possessed, the cell phone pings. Technology had advanced significantly in the decade since Brittanee vanished. New analytical tools allowed investigators to look at that location data with fresh eyes, to triangulate the signals with a precision that was impossible in 2009. They focused on the exact area where the pings had traveled and abruptly stopped, and in that digital haystack, they found a new needle. They cross-referenced the phone data with a list of known sex offenders living in the area at the time, and one name lit up: Raymond Moody, a 62-year-old registered sex offender with a history of violent crimes against women, had been living in a campground in Georgetown County, directly in the path of Brittanee's phone's last journey. The focus of the investigation shifted, silently but seismically, onto Raymond Moody. He had been a person of interest early on, one of hundreds of names, but had been largely overlooked as the investigation pursued other avenues. Now, he was the primary suspect. Investigators began building a new case, piece by methodical piece. They learned that on the night Brittanee disappeared, Moody was in Myrtle Beach. They discovered that he drove a vehicle that matched grainy descriptions from the time. The circumstantial evidence began to mount, forming a dark constellation around him. In May of 2022, 13 years after Brittanee Drexel vanished from the vibrant streets of Myrtle Beach, law enforcement made their move. They arrested Raymond Moody, initially on charges of obstruction of justice. The arrest itself was a major development, But what came next was the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Faced with the mountain of new evidence, and perhaps the crushing weight of his long-held secret, Raymond Moody confessed. The story he told was a brutal, senseless, and deeply personal horror, a stark contrast to the elaborate gang-related theories that had dominated the case for years. There was no stash house, no group of men. There was only him. Moody admitted that he and his girlfriend had been in Myrtle Beach that night and had lured the 17-year-old into their vehicle, preying on a young girl who was alone and far from home. They drove her south, back to their campsite in the secluded woods of Georgetown County. There, in that isolated, terrifying place, Moody's girlfriend left. He was alone with Brittanee. He assaulted her, and then, to silence her, to ensure he would not go back to prison, he strangled the life out of her. The following day, he took her body and buried it in a shallow grave deep in the woods, not far from the campsite. The crime was not a complex conspiracy. It was the simple, predatory act of one man. As part of his confession, Raymond Moody agreed to lead investigators to where he had buried Brittanee. He walked them through the dense South Carolina woods, a landscape that had held its secret for 13 agonizing years, and pointed to a spot. There, investigators began to dig, and on May 11, 2022, they found her. The discovery of Brittanee Drexel's skeletal remains brought an end to the long, desperate search. Dental records provided a swift and certain identification. After 13 years of existing in a tortuous limbo, Brittanee Drexel could finally come home. For her family, the confirmation was a complex wave of emotions, the profound devastation of knowing for certain she was gone, the horror of learning the details of her final hours, but also a sliver of peace. The not knowing, the torment that had been their constant companion for over a decade, was finally over. The search was done. Now, the pursuit of justice could begin. In a Georgetown County courthouse, the final chapter of Brittanee Drexel's story was written. Raymond Moody, the monster who had hidden in plain sight, pleaded guilty to murder, kidnapping, and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. He stood before the court as Brittanee's family, a family he had shattered, confronted him. Dawn Drexel, wearing her daughter's ashes in a necklace, a tangible piece of the child she had lost, looked at the man who had caused her immeasurable pain. She spoke of Brittanee's strength, her fighting spirit, and the bright future that had been stolen from her. She told Moody he was a predator who deserved to suffer for the rest of his useless life. Moody, in his own statement, called himself a monster. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again have the chance to destroy another life. Justice, in its legal form, had been served, but for the Drexel family, the verdict was not an end to their pain. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one where they could finally mourn, finally begin to heal, and focus on preserving the memory not of a victim, but of the vibrant, loving, and determined young woman their Brittanee had been. Her story is a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love, the tenacity of law enforcement, and a tragic reminder of the darkness that can lie just beneath the surface of a sun-drenched paradise.